Well, thanks for joining me here today as we're looking at Romans chapter 8, verse 12, which says, "So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh." So, Paul begins here by saying, "So then." What is Paul going back to in the previous section? Obviously, he's been talking about this contrast between the spirit and the flesh. He's being very emphatic here about how we're not debtors to the flesh. So a lot of what Paul has said obviously applies here. But very specifically, in verse 10, verse 11, Paul does refer to death. Verse 10, although the body is dead because of sin. And verse 11, he talks about our mortal bodies. And so death is linked to the flesh. We've seen that earlier here in Romans chapter 8. So Paul then begins, "So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh." Okay? Even though you are going to physically die, that doesn't mean that you are a debtor to the flesh. Again, because back in 10:11, we have the Spirit who is life for us. So now Paul is trying to be very emphatic so that we turn away from this realm of the flesh, which is the realm of death. He's saying you are not in that realm. Again, very emphatic here. Debtors not to the flesh. And then again he says, meaning to live according to the flesh. So he kind of repeats himself, but also there's a little irony here when he says to live according to the flesh. Well, obviously what Paul has said so far is you can't live in the flesh. That's death. So again, there's a little irony there. There's no way to keep on living in the flesh as a believer and expect to have life. So there's two truths that are really being held in tension here. First truth is that, again, we do not belong to this realm of the flesh. That's not where we are. And so we're not debtors to that realm anymore at all. We don't have to give into that realm. But also there's this ongoing reminder that we are always tempted because of the bodies that we are in this world. Okay? We still have physical bodies that have appetites and desires and passions. And then we have a world that's in rebellion against God. And because we're in the world with this kind of body and all these things are coming into play, it's very tempted to go back to that realm of the flesh. So day-to-day existence, we have these temptations that come to the flesh. And so Paul's want to be very emphatic here. You're not a debtor to this. Don't go back there. Don't pay any money to the flesh. You owe nothing. So Paul is not completely exhorting us here to do this, but it's very implicit here what he's saying. Now, some people think that Paul leaves out a part of his thought here. So he says here, we're not debtors to the flesh, but then what's implied is that we're actually debtors to the Spirit. And people who commentate on this passage kind of go back and forth on it. I kind of lean more toward that's not implied. It does not make sense that Paul would use this language that we are indebted to the Spirit. Anyway, let me close with one final quote from Jon Calvin on this passage. And he's addressing people who would say, they have no power against the flesh. They just want to give up and give in to sin. He says, by adopting such a line of conduct, we wage war, as it were, with God. Since, by contempt and negligence, we extinguish his grace offered for our acceptance. So indeed, God has made a way for us to say no to this whole realm of the flesh. And we need to trust him and believe him, because he has promised grace for us as we do battle against the flesh. Thank you.